Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. Some locks are built to protect money. Others are built to protect a promise that was never meant to be forgotten. The rain had finally stopped over Boston, leaving the streets washed clean beneath a pale afternoon sky. Sunlight reflected off rows of historic brick buildings, while the scent of wet pavement drifted through the open windows of Whitmore Lock and Key, a narrow family-owned shop tucked between an old bookstore and a neighborhood bakery. Inside, Tessa Whitmore tightened the final screw on an antique brass deadbolt before placing it carefully on the wooden counter. At 28, she had rebuilt more broken locks than she could count, but rebuilding her family's struggling business had proven far more difficult. Since her father's passing 4 years earlier, every invoice, every emergency call, every overnight repair had rested on her shoulders. She wasn't looking for miracles anymore. She was simply trying to keep the lights on one more month. The quiet chime above the shop door interrupted her thoughts. A sharply dressed man stepped inside, carrying himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to solving impossible problems. His charcoal suit looked custom-made, yet there was nothing flashy about him. His expression remained polite, almost restrained. "Miss Whitmore," he asked. "That's me. My name is Owen Brooks. I represent Mr. Declan Mercer." The name landed with surprising weight. Everyone in Massachusetts knew Declan Mercer, founder of Mercer Dynamics, billionaire entrepreneur, one of the youngest technology leaders in America. His interviews appeared on financial networks almost weekly, though he rarely smiled for the cameras. "Mr. Mercer needs a locksmith," Owen continued. Tessa couldn't help smiling. Funny. Most billionaires just replace things when they stop working. Owen didn't smile back. This isn't something that can be replaced. 25 minutes later, Tessa's aging pickup truck rolled through the towering wrought iron gates of Mercer Estate. The mansion stood high above the Charles River, surrounded by ancient oak trees and perfectly trimmed gardens stretching farther than she could comfortably see. It looked less like a home and more like a place history had quietly settled into. Expensive cars lined the circular driveway, but the atmosphere felt strangely subdued, almost solemn. Someone had called every security specialist they could find. None of them had succeeded. Declan Mercer stood waiting inside the grand entrance hall. He was taller than she expected, dressed simply in a navy sweater instead of the tailored suits she had seen online. Without the headlines surrounding him, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man who hadn't slept well in weeks. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and although he greeted her politely, something distant lingered behind his steady gaze. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I appreciate you making time." "Depends what we're opening," Tessa answered. "A safe. Combination. Lost. Backup key. Never existed. Manufacturer." He hesitated. "Custom built. Almost 30 years ago." She raised an eyebrow. 30 years. Why hasn't someone drilled it? Declan looked toward the second floor before quietly replying. "Because whatever's inside was the last thing my father told me never to destroy." He led her through silent hallways decorated with family portraits that seemed frozen in another era. Eventually, they entered an old library where towering shelves reached the ceiling. A massive painting hung above the fireplace. Declan walked toward it, pressed a hidden latch, and the painting slowly swung outward. Behind it sat an enormous steel safe built directly into the stone wall. Unlike modern electronic vaults, this one carried intricate mechanical wheels, engraved brass plates, and craftsmanship that belonged to another generation. Tessa stepped closer, brushing her fingertips across the weathered metal. "I've never seen one exactly like this," she whispered. "Neither has anyone else we've hired," Declan admitted. She unpacked her leather tool roll with practiced precision. Tension wrench, fiber optic scope, listening, amplifier, thin steel picks polished by years of use. Every scratch on every tool told its own story. The room became silent except for the soft clicking of metal against metal. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Sweat gathered near her temple despite the cool air inside the library. The mechanism fought every movement she made as though the safe itself refused to surrender its secret. Declan never interrupted. He simply watched, hands folded, carrying the uneasy patience of someone standing at the edge of a memory. Then Tessa heard it, a nearly invisible shift. one tiny metallic sigh buried beneath decades of silence. Her eyes narrowed. She adjusted the final wheel exactly one notch. Another click answered. "I think," she whispered. She wrapped both hands around the heavy handle and slowly pulled. The ancient bolts slid backward with a deep mechanical groan that echoed across the library. The thick steel door opened only a few inches before something slipped free from the upper shelf and drifted gently toward the hardwood floor. It wasn't cash. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't a confidential document. It was an old photograph. Tessa bent down instinctively and picked it up. The color had faded with age, but the little girl smiling into the camera was unmistakable. Blonde hair tied into two uneven braids. Freckles across her nose. The tiny silver compass necklace her father had insisted she wear every summer. She stared at the picture as the blood quietly drained from her face. Her fingers trembled. Across the room, Declan looked from the photograph to Tessa, and for the first time since she had arrived, every trace of composure disappeared from his face. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them seemed able to breathe. Because somehow, inside a billionaire's forgotten safe that had remained sealed for nearly 3 decades, the very first thing waiting to be discovered was a photograph of Tessa Whitmore herself. The photograph rested in Tessa Whitmore's hands with a weight that made no sense. It was only a faded piece of paper, its edges softened by time, yet it felt heavier than every toolbox she had ever carried. The little girl smiling back at her could not have been older than 8. She remembered that summer dress. She remembered scraping her knee climbing the old maple tree behind her childhood home. Most of all, she remembered the tiny silver compass necklace hanging around her neck, a birthday gift from her father who always said, "No matter where life takes you, this will help you find your way home." She had lost that necklace years ago, or at least she had always believed she had. Declan Mercer slowly stepped closer, careful not to invade her space. His voice came out quieter than before. "Is that really you?" Tessa swallowed before answering. "Yes." The single word barely escaped her lips. "I have dozens of family photographs from when I was a kid. This is one of them. I have no idea how it ended up here." Declan looked at the picture again as if hoping it might suddenly explain itself. "I have never seen this photograph before today." She lifted her eyes toward him. "You are telling me a picture of me has been locked inside your father's safe for almost 30 years. That is exactly what I am telling you." Neither of them sounded convinced by their own words. The room settled into an uneasy silence broken only by the ticking of an antique grandfather clock standing near the library door. Tessa finally turned back toward the open safe. Unlike the dramatic vaults people imagined from movies, this one was surprisingly organized. Several leather folders rested neatly on the upper shelves beside a small wooden box and a sealed envelope that had yellowed with age. Nothing appeared disturbed. It was almost as though someone had expected this exact moment and had carefully prepared everything decades earlier. Declan reached for the photograph, but stopped halfway. "May I?" Tessa nodded and handed it to him. He examined the back first. His eyebrows slowly tightened. "There is writing." She moved beside him. The faded blue ink had nearly disappeared, but under the afternoon sunlight spilling through the library windows, they could still make out the sentence. "Keep her safe until I come back." There was no signature, no date, nothing else. Tessa read the words twice before whispering, "Come back from where?" Declan gave a slow shake of his head. "I do not know." She studied the handwriting. "It is not my father's. I would recognize his writing anywhere." Declan compared it to several handwritten labels attached to the folders inside the safe. "It is not my father's either." That realization somehow made the mystery even stranger. If neither father had written the note, then who had? Tessa carefully opened the wooden box resting beside the envelope. Inside lay a tarnished brass key unlike anything she had ever seen. It was far too ornate for an ordinary house. Tiny compass roses had been engraved into both sides of the handle, matching the symbol that had decorated the necklace she had worn as a little girl. Her breathing caught. That cannot be a coincidence. Declan looked from the key to the photograph. "You recognize the design?" "My father carved this exact compass onto almost everything he made. It was his signature." She gently touched the engraving with one fingertip. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. Her father sitting at his old workbench. The smell of cedar wood. Metal shavings catching the afternoon sunlight. the sound of his steady voice telling her that every lock had a story if someone cared enough to listen. She had not thought about those afternoons in years. Declan watched her expression soften before quietly asking, "Did your father ever work for my family?" Tessa frowned. He repaired locks all over eastern Massachusetts. Banks, schools, churches, old homes. I never paid attention to every customer. She paused, but he kept records. Declan's attention sharpened immediately. Records, invoices, appointment books, everything. Before either of them could continue, Owen Brooks entered the library carrying a tablet. He stopped the moment he noticed the safe standing open. His eyes widened with disbelief. "You actually did it." No one answered. Owen sensed the unusual atmosphere and looked from Declan to Tessa before noticing the photograph still resting in Declan's hand. "What happened?" Declan slowly handed him the picture. Owen stared for several long seconds. "Who is this little girl?" Declan answered without taking his eyes off Tessa. "Apparently, the only person my father wanted us to find." Owen Brooks carefully returned the photograph to Declan without another question. Years of working beside the Mercer family had taught him when silence was more valuable than speculation. Declan slipped the picture back onto the library table beside the brass key before turning toward Tessa. "You mentioned your father kept records." She nodded slowly. "He saved everything. He believed every customer deserved a history, even after the job was finished. If those records still exist, they are probably in the storage room behind my shop." Declan did not hesitate. "Would you be willing to look?" Tessa glanced at the open safe one more time. Only an hour earlier she had arrived expecting to unlock a stubborn piece of steel. Instead, she had unlocked a question that somehow belonged to both of them. "Yes," she answered. "Because I need answers just as much as you do." The drive back into Boston felt strangely quiet. Declan insisted on following her instead of sending another assistant. His dark gray SUV remained a respectful distance behind her old pickup as afternoon sunlight slowly gave way to early evening. Neither of them spoke during the drive, but both replayed the same impossible image over and over in their minds. A forgotten photograph, a handwritten promise, a brass key carrying the same compass symbol that had belonged to Tessa's father. By the time they reached Whitmore Lock and Key, the bakery next door had already closed for the day. The familiar smell of fresh bread still drifted across the sidewalk as Tessa unlocked the back entrance of the shop. The storage room looked exactly as it had for years. Dust-covered old filing cabinets. Shelves bowed slightly beneath dozens of labeled boxes. Her father had never thrown away a work order, no matter how small the repair had been. Declan rolled up the sleeves of his sweater without saying a word. Tessa noticed the gesture and smiled faintly. Most billionaires would hire someone else to search through dusty boxes. He returned a small smile of his own. Most billionaires do not find photographs of strangers inside their family safe. For the first time since meeting him, she heard something almost human beneath his composed voice. It was not confidence. It was curiosity mixed with hope. They began opening boxes one by one. Appointment books, receipts, handwritten invoices, maintenance logs dating back more than 30 years. Tessa carefully dusted off each binder while Declan read customer names aloud. Churches, libraries, small businesses, private homes. Hour after hour passed without a single connection. Outside, streetlights flickered on as evening settled across the neighborhood. Tessa leaned back against a shelf with a tired sigh. Maybe the records are gone. Declan reached for one final cardboard box resting on the highest shelf. Unlike the others, it carried no date on the outside. Only one handwritten word appeared across the lid. Private. He lowered it carefully onto the workbench. Tessa stared at her father's handwriting. He never used that label. She slowly lifted the lid. Inside rested a worn leather notebook secured with a faded strap. The edges had cracked with age, but the pages remained surprisingly well preserved. She opened the cover. On the first page, her father's familiar handwriting appeared immediately. Special clients. Declan exchanged a quick glance with her before they turned the page together. Each entry listed only initials instead of full names, followed by addresses and brief notes. Most meant nothing to either of them until Tessa reached a page dated 23 years earlier. Her breathing stopped. Initials D. M. Estate maintenance. Annual vault inspection. Confidential. She looked up at Declan. D.M. He nodded almost automatically. Daniel Mercer. My father. Neither of them spoke as she continued reading the entry beneath it. Client requested emergency lock replacement after unexpected visitor. Child present. Promise remains unchanged. Return key upon completion. Declan frowned. Unexpected visitor. Tessa turned another page. Tucked between the worn sheets rested a faded carbon copy of an invoice. Her father's business letterhead appeared across the top. Customer name. Mercer Estate. Service completed. Custom vault adjustment. Additional request. Secure personal. Belongings belonging to Miss Tessa Whitmore until further notice. Declan stared at the document as though every word challenged everything he believed about his family. My father knew your father. Tessa whispered the correction almost instinctively. Not just knew him. She slowly ran her fingertips across the paper that had survived more than 2 decades. They trusted each other. Before either of them could absorb the discovery, something slipped from the back pocket of the leather notebook and landed softly on the workbench. It was an old Polaroid. This time the picture showed 2 smiling men standing shoulder to shoulder beside a half-built lakeside cabin. One was unmistakably Daniel Mercer. The other was Tessa's father. They looked less like business partners and more like lifelong friends. The old Polaroid remained on the workbench as though neither of them was ready to pick it up again. Tessa traced the faded image with careful eyes. Her father looked younger than she had ever remembered him, laughing freely with one arm resting across Daniel Mercer's shoulder. They stood beside the wooden frame of a lakeside cabin, both wearing work boots covered in sawdust. Behind them, someone had written a date in black marker. June 14th, 2002. Tessa quietly calculated the year. I would have been about 4. Declan nodded slowly. I was 10. He stared at the photograph, searching for memories that refused to come. I never knew my father had a friend like this. Tessa looked at him with gentle surprise. Not even once. He shook his head. After my mother passed away, my father buried himself in work. I remember board meetings, business trips, and charity dinners. I do not remember cabin weekends or smiling like this. The discovery felt strangely bittersweet. It was proof that both fathers had shared a life neither child had ever been allowed to see. Tessa carefully turned the Polaroid over. Another handwritten note appeared beneath the date. Finish the cabin before the fishing season. Bring both kids next time. She froze. Both kids. Declan leaned closer. That means. It means they planned for us to meet. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The quiet hum of the old refrigerator in the back room suddenly seemed unusually loud. Declan finally reached for the leather notebook again. Several pages near the end had been folded inward. Between them rested another small envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Unlike the envelope inside the safe, this one carried a handwritten instruction across the front. Only if something happens to both of us. Tessa slowly exhaled. Do we open it? Declan hesitated. I think whoever left it expected us to. She carefully broke the brittle wax seal. Inside rested a single folded letter. The paper had yellowed, but the handwriting remained remarkably clear. She unfolded it with both hands and began reading aloud. If you are reading this, then life did not unfold the way we hoped. We believed our children would grow up knowing one another like family. We believed there would always be time to explain everything. If that chance has been lost, then the truth must find them another way. Tessa stopped reading for a moment. Her voice caught somewhere between disbelief and emotion. Declan quietly motioned for her to continue. She swallowed and read the next lines. The compass key belongs with the cabin. The cabin belongs with the promise. When the time is right, they will understand. There were no signatures. Only 2 initials appeared beneath the final sentence. D, M, and E.W. Declan looked almost stunned. Edward Whitmore. Tessa nodded. My father. She folded the letter carefully. They wrote it together. A strange warmth settled over the room despite the growing darkness outside. For the first time, the mystery no longer felt random. Someone had intentionally left a trail for them to follow. A photograph, a brass key, a notebook, a letter. Every clue had survived because someone believed the future would eventually bring them together. Declan looked toward the compass key resting beside the notebook. The letter mentioned a cabin. Tessa nodded again. My father loved building small cabins. He said every family deserved one place where time slowed down. Did he ever tell you where this one was? She closed her eyes, reaching deep into childhood memories. At first there was nothing but scattered images. A wooden dock, the smell of pine trees, a blue canoe tied to old posts. Then one memory returned with surprising clarity. Her father lifting her onto his shoulders while pointing toward a weathered wooden sign beside a gravel road. Ash Hollow, she whispered. I remember that name. Declan repeated it softly. Ash Hollow. Tessa walked toward an old wall map that still hung inside the shop. Her father had marked dozens of service locations over the years using tiny colored pins. Most had faded beyond recognition, but one blue pin remained near the western edge of Massachusetts, close to the Berkshire Mountains. Tiny handwriting beside the pin read exactly 2 words. Ash Hollow. Neither of them noticed the shop's front bell ringing until footsteps echoed across the showroom. Owen Brooks appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. Declan, he said, holding up his phone. I just received something from the estate archives. Declan looked up. What is it? Owen's expression had turned unusually serious. The original property records for your father's cabin. He paused before adding the sentence that made both Tessa and Declan look at each other all over again. According to the deed, Daniel Mercer never owned it alone. The second owner's name was Edward Whitmore. The next morning arrived with clear skies and cool mountain air as Declan Mercer guided his SUV west toward the Berkshire Mountains, with Tessa Whitmore sitting quietly beside him. The leather notebook, the brass compass key, and the faded letter rested safely inside a small canvas bag between them. Neither of them had spoken much since leaving Boston. Somehow the silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt shared. The highway slowly gave way to winding two-lane roads lined with towering maple trees whose leaves danced gently in the summer breeze. Every few miles, Tessa noticed another small town with weathered diners, family-owned hardware stores, and white church steeples that seemed untouched by time. She smiled faintly. My father always preferred roads like these. Declan glanced toward her. Mine never seemed to slow down long enough to notice them. She looked out the window again before quietly asking, Do you ever wish you had known him differently? Declan took a long breath before answering. Every day since we opened that safe. His honesty surprised even himself. Usually interviews, board meetings, and business negotiations required carefully measured words. Around Tessa, those carefully built walls seemed to disappear without permission. 2 hours later, a weathered wooden sign appeared beside the narrow road. Ash Hollow. The faded letters matched the memory Tessa had carried since childhood. She felt a quiet shiver as Declan turned onto an old gravel lane almost hidden beneath overgrown branches. Wildflowers covered both sides of the path, and birds drifted lazily between the pine trees overhead. After another half-mile, the forest opened to reveal a peaceful lake reflecting the blue morning sky like polished glass. Near the shoreline stood a small cedar cabin. Time had weathered its walls, but it remained standing with quiet dignity. Tessa stepped out of the vehicle first. She slowly walked toward the porch, her boots crunching across the gravel. Something deep inside her recognized the place before her mind could fully explain why. She rested one hand against the porch railing. I have been here before. Declan joined her. You remember? She closed her eyes. At first came only fragments. The smell of fresh lumber. Laughter carried across the lake. Someone teaching 2 children how to skip stones across the water. She frowned. I cannot see faces. Declan looked toward the dock extending into the lake. Neither can I. The front door remained secured by an old handcrafted lock unlike anything found in modern homes. Tessa removed the brass compass key from the canvas bag. The engraving sparkled softly beneath the sunlight. She carefully slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. With one smooth turn, the mechanism released as though it had been waiting years for exactly this moment. The cabin door slowly opened. Dust floated gently through narrow beams of sunlight streaming across the wooden floor. Everything inside remained astonishingly preserved. A stone fireplace occupied one wall. Handcrafted. Furniture stood exactly where someone had left it decades earlier. Fishing rods rested neatly in one corner beside an old canoe paddle. It felt less like an abandoned building and more like someone had simply stepped outside for a few minutes. Tessa slowly explored the room while Declan examined framed photographs displayed across the mantel. Most showed 2 families smiling together beside campfires, picnic tables, and the lake. Some photographs had faded too badly to identify faces clearly, but others remained surprisingly sharp. Tessa stopped suddenly in front of one frame. Two little children stood side by side, holding tiny fishing poles. One was a young boy with dark hair. The other was a little blonde girl wearing a silver compass necklace. Her heart nearly stopped. Declan. He walked over immediately. Neither of them needed to ask the question. They both knew. The boy was him. The girl was Tessa. They had met before. They had played together before. They had smiled for this photograph before. Yet neither of them remembered it. Declan gently lifted the frame from the mantel. A folded sheet of paper slipped from behind the photograph and floated onto the floor. He unfolded it carefully. It was another handwritten note from their fathers. If these memories have faded, do not be afraid. Friendships built on truth always find their way home. Let the cabin remind you who you were before the world became complicated. Tessa looked around the quiet room with tears gathering in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming feeling that pieces of her own life had been quietly waiting here all along. Declan folded the letter with extraordinary care before placing it beside the photograph. He looked at Tessa, and for the first time since they had met, neither of them saw a billionaire or a locksmith standing across the room. They simply saw two people whose lives had been connected long before either of them had understood why. Then Tessa noticed something else. Built into the stone fireplace was a narrow iron door no larger than a briefcase. Another lock, older than the first one, and engraved into its center was the very same compass symbol. Tessa Whitmore knelt beside the narrow iron door built into the old stone fireplace, running her fingertips across the familiar compass engraving. Unlike the massive safe at Mercer Estate, this lock was handcrafted with remarkable precision. She could almost imagine her father's hands shaping every tiny groove. "He built this," she whispered. Declan Mercer lowered himself beside her. "You are certain?" She nodded without hesitation. Every locksmith leaves behind small habits, little details no one else notices. The placement of these screws, the shape of this keyway, the compass engraved slightly off-center. That was my father. She removed the brass compass key from her jacket pocket, but before inserting it, she paused. If our fathers wanted us to find this, they also wanted us to be ready for whatever is inside. Declan gave her a reassuring smile. "I think we have already come too far to stop now." She slowly inserted the key. Once again it fit perfectly. A soft metallic click echoed through the cabin as the mechanism released. The small iron door swung open to reveal a hidden compartment lined with cedar wood. There was no money, no jewelry, no legal documents waiting to change someone's fortune overnight. Instead, the compartment held a weathered leather journal, two cloth-wrapped bundles, and a small wooden music box decorated with the same compass rose that had quietly guided every clue along their journey. Tessa carefully lifted the journal first. The cover carried two names burned into the leather: Daniel Mercer and Edward Whitmore. She looked toward Declan. They wrote one journal together. He nodded quietly. "Open it." The first several pages contained handwritten notes describing weekends spent building the cabin, repairing old boats, teaching two children to fish, and dreaming about the future. Every page revealed two fathers who trusted each other completely. Tessa smiled through moist eyes as she read one entry aloud. Declan finally caught his first fish today. Tessa insisted it was too small and threw it back before anyone could stop her. They laughed harder than we did. Declan laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like something an 8-year-old girl would do." She smiled. Apparently, I was very opinionated. As they continued reading, the joyful entries gradually became less frequent. The handwriting grew heavier. The final pages carried a seriousness neither of them had expected. Edward believes someone inside the company is manipulating financial records. Daniel refuses to ignore it any longer. We agreed to gather proof quietly before involving anyone else. Tessa looked up. "Inside Mercer Dynamics?" Declan slowly nodded. The company was much smaller back then, but yes. She turned another page. Daniel wrote that if anything happened before the truth came out, everything important must remain protected until the children are old enough to decide together what comes next. Declan rested one hand against the old wooden table, trying to absorb each sentence. His father had not simply hidden memories. He had protected something far greater. Tessa carefully unfolded the first cloth bundle. Inside rested two silver compass necklaces lying side by side. One was unmistakably hers. Although worn with age, She immediately recognized the tiny scratch near the edge where she had accidentally dropped it as a child. Tears quietly filled her eyes. I thought this was lost forever. Beneath it rested a second necklace, identical except for one small difference. The back carried the engraved initials D.M. Declan looked genuinely surprised. My father made one for me too. Tessa smiled gently. Looks like neither of us ever received them. They opened the second bundle together. Inside lay 2 friendship bracelets made from faded blue and white cord. Childish knots held them together imperfectly. A small handwritten tag rested beside them. Made by Tessa and Declan. Summer friends forever. Neither of them spoke. They simply looked at the bracelets, realizing that somewhere deep beneath forgotten childhood memories, a friendship had once existed before life quietly carried them in separate directions. Declan carefully closed the journal before lifting the small wooden music box. He turned the tiny brass handle. A gentle melody filled the cabin, soft and familiar. Tessa closed her eyes instantly. Images rushed back all at once. Running along the lakeshore, chasing dragonflies, sitting beside a campfire while 2 fathers laughed nearby. A little dark-haired boy handing her a smooth skipping stone because hers kept sinking. She opened her eyes suddenly. I remember you. Declan stared at her in stunned silence. She smiled through tears. You always skipped 7 stones across the lake. I could never get past 3. Before Declan could answer, something unexpected happened. As the melody reached its final note, a hidden latch beneath the fireplace released with a quiet click, revealing another narrow compartment that neither of them had noticed before. The newly revealed compartment was so well concealed that even Tessa Whitmore almost missed its outline against the old stone. She carefully reached inside and found a flat cedar box no larger than a legal envelope. Unlike everything else they had discovered, this box carried a small brass plaque engraved with a single sentence. For Declan and Tessa. Together. She looked at Declan before slowly lifting the lid. Inside rested a neatly organized collection of documents secured beneath a leather strap. On top lay a folded letter written in Daniel Mercer's unmistakably elegant handwriting. Declan unfolded it with unusual care. His voice remained steady at first, but it softened as he began reading aloud. If you have reached this place together, then you have already proven something more valuable than wealth. You chose trust over fear. That is why you deserve the truth. Beneath the letter rested several sealed financial records along with copies of handwritten meeting notes from more than 20 years earlier. Declan scanned the first page, and the color slowly drained from his face. These are internal company reports. Tessa leaned closer. Several entries had been highlighted in red ink. Numbers had been altered. Project budgets no longer matched the original approvals. Entire investments appeared to have been quietly redirected. Daniel Mercer had written careful notes in the margins documenting every inconsistency he discovered. At the bottom of one page, another sentence stood out. I cannot prove who is responsible yet, but someone inside. The company is preparing to betray everything we built. Tessa looked toward Declan. Your father knew something was wrong. He nodded slowly, and he was collecting evidence. They continued sorting through the documents until one familiar name appeared repeatedly beside dozens of financial approvals. Victor Mercer. Declan's expression tightened. Victor was his father's younger brother and the current vice chairman of Mercer Dynamics. Throughout Declan's career, his uncle had always presented himself as the loyal family advisor who helped preserve Daniel Mercer's legacy after his passing. Declan quietly shook his head. This cannot be right. Tessa studied another page before answering carefully. Your father did not write these notes emotionally. He documented everything like someone building a case. Declan lowered himself into one of the old wooden chairs, unable to look away from the evidence. Childhood memories slowly returned. Victor had attended every birthday after Daniel died. He had guided Declan through his first board meeting. He had always insisted the past should remain buried because focusing on the future honored the family better than chasing old questions. Suddenly, those conversations sounded completely different. Tessa gently placed one hand on the table rather than on Declan, giving him space instead of comfort he had not asked for. Whatever happened back then, your father wanted you to know the truth, not carry someone else's version of it. Declan looked at her with quiet gratitude. I spent 24 years believing my father left me a business. Maybe he actually left me a responsibility. Before either of them could continue, Declan's phone vibrated across the table. Owen Brooks. Declan answered immediately. Owen. His assistant's voice sounded unusually tense. Where are you? Ash Hollow. There was a brief silence. You need to come back to Boston as soon as possible. Your uncle called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. Declan frowned. Why? He says several confidential company files have disappeared from the estate archive. Declan exchanged a quick glance with Tessa. Neither of them had touched the archive. Owen continued before Declan could respond. There is something else. Someone entered the archive late last night. Security footage shows the person searched specifically for your father's records. Declan's expression hardened. Did they find what they were looking for? Apparently not. Owen hesitated before adding one final detail. Victor personally ordered the search. After the call ended, the cabin became silent once again. Tessa slowly closed the cedar box. If your uncle is looking for these documents, then he does not know they are here. Declan nodded. Which means my father successfully kept them hidden. She looked around the peaceful cabin that had protected two families' memories for decades. But now he knows someone else may have found them. Declan stood and carefully gathered every document back into the cedar box. Then we do exactly what our fathers hoped we would do. Tessa looked at him. Which is? He met her eyes with a calm confidence that had nothing to do with wealth or business. We faced this together. As they stepped onto the porch carrying the cedar box, neither of them noticed a dark SUV parked far beyond the tree line where the gravel road disappeared into the forest. Its engine remained off. Hidden behind the windshield, someone quietly lowered a pair of binoculars after watching them leave the cabin. The Mercer Dynamics headquarters overlooked downtown Boston, its glass exterior reflecting the early morning sunlight as employees and board members streamed through the revolving doors. Declan Mercer stepped out of his vehicle with the cedar box secured inside a simple leather briefcase. Tessa Whitmore walked beside him, wearing the same navy blazer she reserved for important business appointments. She felt slightly out of place among executives dressed in expensive suits, but the steady glance Declan gave her as they entered the building reminded her why she was there. She was no longer simply a locksmith. She had become part of a promise their fathers had entrusted to both of them. Owen Brooks met them inside the private executive lobby. Relief crossed his face the moment he saw Declan. Everything is ready, he said quietly. The board meeting starts in 15 minutes. Victor has already arrived. Declan nodded. Has anyone seen the archive documents? Owen shook his head. No. Whatever he was searching for, he did not find it. They rode the private elevator in silence until the doors opened onto the executive floor. The boardroom overlooked the Boston skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. Around the polished walnut table sat 12 directors representing decades of Mercer Dynamics history. At the far end sat Victor Mercer, his silver hair perfectly combed, his expression calm and welcoming as though nothing unusual had happened. He stood immediately. Declan. I was beginning to worry. Declan offered a polite nod. Traffic from western Massachusetts. Victor's eyes briefly shifted toward Tessa. And who is our guest? Before Declan could answer, Tessa extended her hand confidently. Tessa Whitmore. Victor smiled with practiced courtesy while shaking it. A pleasure. For the briefest moment, his smile faltered. It lasted less than a second, but Declan noticed it. The name Whitmore meant something to him. Everyone took their seats as the meeting officially began. Victor addressed the room with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to leading difficult conversations. Unfortunately, confidential records have disappeared from our estate archive. Until we determine who accessed them, I recommend suspending all historical reviews connected to the company's early financial structure. Several board members nodded in agreement. Declan quietly listened until Victor finished speaking. Then he stood. Before anyone votes, there is something the board deserves to see. He placed the leather briefcase on the conference table and carefully removed the cedar box. Curious whispers spread throughout the room. Victor's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Declan opened the box and removed the journal written by Daniel Mercer and Edward Whitmore. He laid beside it the financial reports, the handwritten investigation notes, and finally the letter addressed to him and Tessa. The room became silent. These documents were left by my father, Declan said evenly. He preserved them because he believed the truth mattered more than convenience. One director leaned forward. Where did you find them? Declan answered without hesitation. exactly where my father intended them to be found. Victor remained remarkably composed. Old documents often lack context. Declan met his uncle's eyes. Then let us provide context. He handed copies of Daniel Mercer's handwritten notes to every director around the table. The pages documented altered project budgets, unauthorized transfers, and repeated concerns regarding internal approvals linked to Victor Mercer. No accusations. Only carefully recorded facts supported by original financial records. The directors quietly compared the documents to archived reports displayed on the large conference screen as Owen projected them one by one. Numbers matched perfectly. Dates aligned. Every discrepancy Daniel Mercer had documented still existed inside the company's official archives. No one spoke for several long moments. Finally, one senior director slowly removed his reading glasses. Victor. His voice remained calm but firm. Why were these reports never presented to the board? Victor remained composed, folding his hands together before answering. Daniel became overly suspicious near the end of his life. He misunderstood several restructuring decisions. Tessa quietly stepped forward. Every eye turned toward her. She placed the faded Polaroid onto the conference table beside the journal. My father trusted Daniel Mercer enough to hide these records with him for more than 20 years. They expected their children to uncover them together because they believed truth should belong to the next generation, not disappear with the previous one. Her words carried no anger, only quiet conviction. The room remained completely still. Several directors exchanged thoughtful glances. The evidence spoke more clearly than emotion ever could. Victor looked around the table and realized the confidence he had carried into the meeting had quietly disappeared. One director finally stood. Given the newly presented documentation, I move that an independent outside audit begin immediately and that all historical financial records connected to these reports be preserved for review. Another director immediately seconded the motion. One after another, hands rose across the table. Declan looked toward the large portrait of Daniel Mercer hanging at the end of the boardroom. For the first time since discovering the safe, he felt something inside him finally settle. His father had not left behind a mystery meant to divide people. He had left behind the opportunity to restore honesty, friendship, and a promise that had waited more than 2 decades to be fulfilled. 1 year later, the cedar cabin at Ash Hollow looked more alive than it had in decades. Fresh paint covered the porch railings. Colorful wildflowers surrounded the front steps, and children's laughter drifted gently across the quiet lake as families gathered for the cabin's reopening ceremony. What had once been a forgotten place filled with unanswered questions had become the Mercer and Whitmore Family Foundation Retreat, a peaceful space where local families, apprentices, veterans, and young tradespeople could learn practical skills, spend time together, and rediscover the value of community. Inside the restored cabin, every meaningful discovery from the previous year had been carefully preserved. The leather journal rested safely inside a climate-controlled display case. The faded Polaroid of 2 smiling children stood beside the photograph of Daniel Mercer and Edward Whitmore building the cabin together. The brass compass key no longer hid inside a forgotten compartment. Instead, it hung inside a handcrafted wooden frame beneath a small engraved plaque that read, "Some promises only make sense when the right people finally find each other." Tessa Whitmore smiled as she adjusted the display one last time. Her locksmith shop in Boston was thriving once again, but now it carried a new name across the front window: Whitmore Restoration and Security. Mercer Dynamics had quietly become its largest commercial client. Although Declan had insisted every contract be awarded through the same competitive process as everyone else. "Your work earned this," he had told her months earlier. "Not your connection to me." That sentence had meant more to Tessa than any business agreement ever could. Across the lake, Declan Mercer stood on the rebuilt dock watching several children compete to see who could skip a stone the farthest across the water. He smiled as one little girl celebrated reaching 4 skips, while another insisted she could do better. The simple scene reminded him of the memories the music box had awakened inside the cabin. For years he had measured success by quarterly reports, acquisitions, and stock prices. Now he understood why his father had protected this place so carefully. Some investments could never be measured in dollars. Owen Brooks walked onto the dock, carrying a small envelope. "Everything is ready," he said with a knowing smile. Declan accepted the envelope and quietly thanked him. Moments later, guests gathered near the old fireplace inside the cabin where both families had once shared countless evenings together. Several Mercer Dynamics board members attended the ceremony alongside longtime customers from Whitmore Lock and Key. Even the independent audit committee had completed its review months earlier, confirming Daniel Mercer's original concerns and implementing sweeping governance reforms that restored confidence throughout the company. Rather than allowing bitterness to define the future, Declan had chosen transparency, accountability, and renewal. It was exactly the kind of leadership his father had hoped to leave behind. As the afternoon sun poured through the cabin windows, Declan gently asked Tessa if she would join him near the fireplace. She smiled, assuming he wanted to show her another restoration detail. Instead, he reached into the same hidden compartment that had once protected their father's journal. "There is one last thing this place has been keeping safe," he said softly. Tessa looked at him with curious eyes. Declan opened the envelope and carefully unfolded a single sheet of paper. It was blank except for one familiar handwritten sentence copied from the old note they had discovered inside the safe many months earlier. "Keep her safe until I come back." Beneath it, Declan had added one new line in his own handwriting. "I finally found my way back. This time, I would like to stay." He folded the paper, placed it beside the framed brass compass key, and then slowly lowered himself onto one knee. From his jacket pocket, he removed a small wooden ring box crafted from cedar taken from the original cabin porch during the restoration. Inside rested a simple diamond ring surrounded by two tiny compass engravings instead of elaborate decoration. "Tessa," he said quietly, "our fathers spent years protecting a promise they hoped we would one day understand. They gave us memories, friendship, and the courage to trust each other before either of us even remembered why. You reminded me that the strongest things in life are not companies or fortunes. They are honesty, kindness, and the people who choose to stand beside us when the answers are uncertain. I cannot promise that every road ahead will be easy, but I can promise that I will never stop walking it with you. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Tessa's eyes long before she found her voice. She laughed softly through those tears, the same warm laugh that had once echoed through the cabin as a little girl without either of them remembering it. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." As Declan slipped the ring onto her finger, the guests surrounding them quietly applauded. Outside, a gentle breeze carried ripples across the lake while sunlight reflected against the water exactly as it had years before when two lifelong friends dreamed about the future of their children. The old Locks had finally surrendered every secret they were meant to protect, but the greatest treasure had never been hidden inside a safe, a cabin, or a forgotten compartment. It had been waiting patiently inside two lives that were always meant to find each other again. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to The Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.